countries which have gender equality, particularly in terms of health, education, and labor force participation, grow faster than countries that have less gender equality. My name is Elissa Braunstein, and I'm professor and chair at the Department of Economics at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And social reproduction refers to the time and commodities that it takes to produce and maintain and invest in the labor force. So by time, I mean both paid and unpaid time, and commodities refers to goods and services that are purchased in order to create and invest in human beings. And the importance of social reproduction from a macroeconomic perspective, right, is that economic growth, processes of economic growth and development need labor as an input. But macroeconomists almost never treat labor as produced. It's sort of treated like a natural resource that spontaneously emerges out of the earth when you need it. Sometimes, right, we do get the production of human capital incorporated into macroeconomic models of growth and development. But when that is incorporated, it's almost always restricted to formal education or work experience, right? The tremendous expenses, both in terms of time and money, that go into generating human beings is never really explicitly considered in macroeconomic models. And this overlaps with gender, right, because of the traditional sexual division of labor, where women are primarily tasked with at least the time aspects of care work, right, which is the kind of labor that's involved in producing and reproducing the labor force. And so, you know, one thing that economists do generally is they focus on the market sector only. So it's only to the extent, right, that activities are monetized and move through the market sector that economists tend to think about them very carefully. And so from a macroeconomic perspective, all of the time and resources that are put into creating and maintaining the labor force is not something that is thought of as a macroeconomic problem. But by incorporating the processes of social reproduction, right, we can better understand, right, how dynamics both within and outside of the market, a lot of those dynamics being gendered, right, in the sense of different dynamics between men and women, have macroeconomic causes as well as consequences. And so I've done work, theoretical work, which incorporates social reproduction into a macroeconomic model of growth and development. So we can understand, for instance, how things like women's increasing market labor force participation, right, which, if you're just looking at the market, looks like a gain to economic growth, right, because women's production is transitioning from the non-market sector to the market sector. And now that it's measured, it looks like an increase in economic growth. But in fact, right, it's not just a transfer, right? There's been an overall change in the dynamics of production. So, for instance, women who are now working in the market may buy more care services, right, to substitute for the time that they no longer spend in the non-market sector. And that, in addition, contributes to economic growth. But there can also be compromises, right, to the non-market production. So, for instance, when women increase their participation in the market labor force and they find that their time is squeezed, right, that they don't have enough time to perform both the market labor and the non-market labor that they want to. And so that can compromise economic growth to the extent that in maintenance and investment in the labor force, right, gets compromised because of some contradictions in the system. So the point of this work is that by incorporating social reproduction, I think, as I said at the beginning, we can better understand the causes, right, and consequences of macroeconomic dynamics. I differentiate between two different cases, and one is where economic growth is care-led, and the other one is where economic growth is inequality-led. And when economic growth is care-led, that means that as women increase their participation in the labor market, and there's more gender equality in the labor market, that what I call human capacities are also enhanced by this increased economic activity. And the kinds of institutions, right, that support that sort of win-win scenario are, for instance, where the public sector, for instance, provides support for caring labor, where care sector workers are well paid, for instance, so that when you do start to substitute market commodities for the kind of care work that you used to do at home, there is no sacrifice in terms of quality, for instance. So countries with large public investments in, or public provisioning of care services, for instance, tend to be more care-led. On the other hand, countries that are more inequality-led are one where you could think of sort of public provisioning for care as being pretty impoverished. So for instance, that you have to find largely private solutions to your care needs when families start to increase their attachment to the labor market. And you could think of a country like the United States, for instance, as an example of an inequality-led scenario where when women increase their labor force participation, they have to sort of find substitutes or deal with the consequences, the care consequences of their increased labor force participation on their own. In addition, there's a supply side, and the supply side is about the distribution of the costs of social reproduction, right? The time and the money costs of social reproduction between women, men, the state, and capital. And so I also differentiate between two polar cases on the supply side, one being gender egalitarian, where there's an equal distribution of responsibility for social reproduction among women, men, the state, and capital. That's one aspect, versus feminization of responsibility and obligation, where women bear largely on their own the time and money costs of social reproduction. And so you end up with this 2x2, right, sort of table and 4 cases. 2 of the cases, the supply and demand sides of the economy, complement one another. There's the win-win scenario, which combines care-led with gender egalitarian supply side, right? So that's where the dynamics of social reproduction and the dynamics of growth are complementary. But then there are 2 cases where you have contradictions between the supply and demand sides of the economy. And in the inequality-led and gender egalitarian case, that is what I call a wage squeeze case, where on the one hand, women's increased market labor force participation, because the costs of social reproduction are equitably shared, is good for human capacities and the provision of care. But that gender egalitarianism in the economy compromises growth. Women's wage increases, makes care services too expensive, and there are a lot of complicated sort of sub-processes that are going on, but the point is that the social reproduction system contradicts the growth system. And so in those kinds of countries, growth is volatile or short-term because you have these tensions in the system. And those kinds of tensions you could also see when growth is inequality-led, or growth is care-led, rather, but women, it's a feminization of responsibility and obligation. So that's another example of a contradiction between the supply and demand side. When you do this kind of economics work, you're talking to either other economists or country governments, or you're really trying to make the case that social reproduction is important for the kinds of economic processes that we care about. So even if you don't care very much about gender inequality, you're not convinced, right, that the non-market sector is important to model explicitly, and that it just sort of follows along with the market sector, and in fact, people just sort of spontaneously spring out of the earth. I mean, you know that they don't, but maybe you don't think it's economically important to have any other model of it. The point of this kind of work, I think, right, is to make the argument, right, that processes of social reproduction actually do have economic consequences. As you may be aware, gender equality as smart economics, right, is sort of an increasingly common stylized fact, right, that all else equal, countries which have gender equality, particularly in terms of health, education, and labor force participation, grow faster than countries that have less gender equality. So from the World Bank to the International Monetary Fund to the World Economic Forum, right to the United Nations, promoting gender equality is partly substantiated on the economic returns to gender equality. So you have increasing female labor force participation in most countries in the world at the same time that you have declining male labor force participation. So to some extent, we might ask the question of to what extent is women's increasing labor force participation gender conflictual, right, in the sense that we want to have gains for women, but not at the expense of men's outcomes. And so, you know, backing up a little bit here, so we're looking at the entire labor market, and the point about stratification and segmentation comes in with the fact that it's increasingly difficult for both women and men to find what we call good jobs. And good jobs are jobs in the formal sector, right, with better wages, more likely to be associated with benefits or internal job ladders, that sort of thing. So if women are being integrated in the labor market, right, at the same time that the overall quality of jobs is declining, the question is, on what terms are they being integrated in the labor market? When I started economics, I just sort of fell into it, but I was interested in questions of gender and questions of development, and it was clear to me that the scholars that had the most cachet in those conversations were the economists. I mean, I thought a lot more closely, I think, to how sociologists thought about the world or how anthropologists did field work. But in sort of looking around me, it felt like the economists were the one with the power. And I think that is true in terms of how seriously we are taken by governments and policymakers. And so if you want to have an impact on the world and you're choosing, right, a pathway, I would say go for economics. And then within economics in particular, I would also encourage women to seriously consider macroeconomics. Within economics, macroeconomics is a very male-dominated subfield, and I think it has impacts on macroeconomic thinking and the kinds of issues that macroeconomists think about, and even the centrality of economic growth, right, in conversations about macroeconomics, I think is partly a reflection of those identities. So we need a wider diversity of voices doing this kind of work.